Okay. What I was going to say to start with is that I've mentioned a little bit about this text that we're reading, and I mentioned that it was discovered. I discovered it in around about 2013. When I say I discovered it, it's part of the Rabbi Ralphit collection, and I went to visit him after negotiating rights for these texts, and we photographed all of his collection, which was around about 130 items. Around about 12,000 photographs, which we did over a course of just under 2 weeks. So it was about 1,000 photographs a day. So you'll understand that there was a lot of material there, and it was not entirely catalogued. Much of it he identified himself, but I wished to catalogue it in a different way and to compare it to other materials that we had and write up all the dates. And I found on the back of one of the manuscripts the following item, and here's the photograph. So this was the back of the manuscript here, and as you can see, it's not entirely readable. You can see that there are patches covering the text. The reason was that the owners of the manuscript were more interested in the text that was on the other side, which was the classical text, the religious text, and they weren't as interested in this side of the text because this was just a narrative account that I don't think interested them quite as much. From my perspective, it was the other way around. When I started examining the colophons, I realized that in fact the text on the back was much rarer than the text on the front, because the text on the front we knew from other manuscripts, and this was the earliest example of written colloquial Mandaic in this way, with complete sentences written in the colloquial. And so I returned to the Netherlands a number of years ago, specifically to try to photograph the other parts of this manuscript. So if I show you this section here, as you can see, the patch has been put on to protect the manuscript, but it covers the text. And the question is whether it was possible to uncover the material that was underneath this paper patch. Obviously, we couldn't remove the patch because that would damage the manuscript. So the question is whether with lighting, we could do this. So here I'm showing you, can you see the cursor here? Yeah, I'll put this little light on, hold on. Here, you see this? Can you see the red dot here? Yeah, so this is Mem Aleph Reish Yod Aleph Zain Vav Zain Aleph, Mare Zuza, the owner of money. In other words, a wealthy man. But underneath, you can see this line is damaged, and then until we come to this line, Ilawi, and Brei, we don't have the text. So what we did is we took the manuscript and we placed it over a light. I brought the light with me and we placed it over a light, and the result was this. This is the result. So here you have the word Mare Zuza, and I'll take you back here. This is the only words you can read here. Here you have the line beneath, which is damaged, but in the photograph that we have here, you can actually see the words that were apparently missing. Imma, Reish, Ruahe. The problem you have is that the text from the other side of the manuscript is breaking through. So you have to realize that these letters don't belong to the text on this side, they belong to the text on the other side. And sometimes it can be confusing. So what I did is I produced a reverse version of this photograph, and that helped me to isolate which letters, which was easier to read, which letters belong to the text on the back. I also have a photograph of the other side of the manuscript, and that way I was able to read all of these words, Mindi, Qam, Inthi, here. All of these words are completely invisible in the original photograph. If we look here, until we get to this Arzin, apparently Arzidin, sorry, and then that will be down here somewhere on this side of the manuscript. So by using lighting and lighting the manuscript from the other side, I was able to recover virtually everything that was written in these covered sections. At the very edge of the manuscript on this side, there was still quite a bit of damage, which was not readable. And here and there were certain letters that were difficult, but the text was sufficiently important that I felt that it was worth putting in the effort to try to recover the lost text. So this is how essentially we recovered the earliest vernacular text. Of course, it has to be, the law of ancient manuscript states that whenever you have a very important manuscript, it will always be damaged. So it had to be that the text that was the most vernacular in its content would be the one that was the worst preserved and the one that had been patched up. So let's go back to this. This is our invitation for today, and this is the manuscript. But what you will not see here is you won't see where I've reconstructed it, because essentially I could read it. If I was unable to read something, I marked it as unreadable. So let's go. We were up to here, I believe. Badara bisha khayusta zgat min lidba, the Barnoshi. La baba laqhais ele baziro, وبازير لقهايس إلى بابا. Now, first of all, the word baba, papa, is an ancient word. It already appears in Hebrew and Aramaic documents, certainly Aramaic from late antiquity, but it comes to replace the word av or abba in Mandaic. In the colloquial, both words existed side by side, but here we see that he uses the colloquial word rather than the classical word. As for laqahais, the qa prefix that marks the present tense is already found, of course, in Jewish Babylonian Aramaic. I say, of course, because anyone who has learned anything of Jewish Babylonian Aramaic has encountered this in the very first pages of the Talmud. It becomes compulsory in the spoken language. It's very rare in literary Mandaic. It's very rare in classical Mandaic. Don't recall if any examples appear in the Magic Bowl texts or in the Lamellae. Certainly in the literary texts, it's extremely rare, and in the manuscripts. But in Neo-Mandaic, it's compulsory. It's part of the grammatical system that the present tense is marked with pa, and only subordinate forms or volative forms lack it. So here we see he just simply uses everywhere, as in the vernacular, laqahais, father does not have mercy. And then we have this ilay instead of illa or al, upon. And this is also characteristic of the vernacular. In Neo-Mandaic, we have forms like ilyo, and we see that he uses both forms interchangeably, ilay and ilo. How he pronounced it exactly, I don't know. But we see that one time he writes with the very vernacular ilay. As I said, in Neo-Mandaic, this survives in a slightly different form. El-Bazira, and Bazira means offspring, and that's what it means also in Neo-Mandaic. The fact is, it actually means that in the earliest Mandaic text too. It can mean seed, and it can also mean offspring, children. So it's an ancient usage that's also preserved into the modern usage. Ubazira laqahais elo baba. And now we have an expression that is actually used frequently in the classical text too. He returns to the formulaic use. Ana ya abda, I, a servant. The ya here is the Persian numeral 1, also used as an indefinite article, a. أنا يا أبدأ أنسيت هزين ديوان who copied this diwan, this scroll, and this is again the classical language. This is the formulaic usage of the classical language, but now he's going to go back into the vernacular. So what he's doing is he's taking the framework of the colophons, placing all the standard things that you put in. I copied this text and etc. But then as soon as he's telling his own story, he goes into the vernacular. And he says, Baba qare tlathinshe. My father had 3 wives. Qare is by in German, with him. We already have the word iqar and iqari in the classical language, meaning in this meaning, in the meaning of shay, by, and in Neo-Mandaic, it becomes the only word for this use. Qar, and it's shortened to qar. But we see in the classical language that it's iqar. Okay, Babai, sorry, I'm lost here. Here we go. My father had 3 wives. وَإِمَّا بْرَتْ دَعَامُي was the daughter of his paternal uncle. And Amui is obviously an Arabic loanword. And you see that in all of the colophons, they, right from the earliest ones, they are using the Arabic ayin sign. I don't know if I can show this to you here in the manuscript, if I can get the previous photograph. Line 9, we said, in sheet. Here we go. Brata da Amui. So this is the Arabic ayin. And all of the manuscripts, from the earliest manuscripts that we have, from the 17th, 16th century, they're already using Arabic ayin symbol within the Mandaic context to reflect the ayin letter. The ayin consonant, sorry. They're using the Arabic ayin letter for the Arabic ayin consonant, and only for that. So it's clearly a borrowing of the Arabic alphabet into Mandaic. Let's return to our text. And it says, my mother, Brat Amoi Haqqa, and this seems to be the legitimate one. Umitsaita, and the middle one, Brat the Sham'an Sahula, which is a name, Min Hiwari, and that's a Mandaean tribe. We know this name from elsewhere. Wakhairin min Bidurat. Khairi could possibly be the last one from Akhir, or it's possibly a personal name. I thought it was a personal name here because we have it later where it seems to be a personal name. And Bidurat, I don't know what that is. A name, a place name, a tribal name. I haven't found it elsewhere, so I'm unable to identify it. Umatsaita, and the middle one, Barata the Sham'an, Behaweza Hawat. And Haweza is the name of a town. We know the town, it's in Khuzestan, it's on the eastern side of the Euphrates. It's quite a well-known town. And in fact, the grandfather, Rabbi Rafid, who owns this manuscript, was from Haweza. He was born in Haweza. The Mandaean community would move frequently from Iran and between Iran and Iraq. It's all part of the same area, the Shat al-Arab area, and the communities were closely connected. However, already by the 19th century, perhaps even earlier, the Mandaeans of Iraq were speaking mostly Arabic, and the Mandaeans of Iran were continuing to speak in Mandaic. And this is a question to what extent the Mandaic that we found in Iraq in the 20th century was in fact just simply the spoken language of migrants who had come from Iran. There is some evidence that that is the case. But we're now in the 17th century, sorry, and it's clearly a spoken language here. But as I'll show you, What's striking is how similar this language is to the modern language. I've already mentioned some points in which it differs from the modern vernacular, but it's also very similar to the modern vernacular. Okay, so it says Sham'an was in Hawaiza. Hawat, she was in Hawaiza. Hidda wa imma. She and her mother. Now, the form Hidda is astonishing. Astonishing because it's used in the Neo-Mandaic of today, and it has absolutely no precedent in the classical language. It is almost certainly a compound of he, the classical Aramaic pronoun, and the, that one, he, the, or he, the. Today they pronounce it he, the. And we have a lot of these compound pronouns in Semitic languages. We have things like hainu and wuktu in Ge'ez and zoti in modern spoken Hebrew, where the pronoun has merged with a personal pronoun has merged with another pronoun as a little sentence, and then it becomes the pronoun itself. So hida is unique to this text and to spoken Mandaic. And as I said, it's surprising to find it so early in a text, but it's one of the signs that this is really written in the vernacular, because this is not a classical form in any way. So we had Hida wa imma. And now we continue. Ahwath Zuzi, she gave money, and Zuza, which is the name of a coin, becomes simply the Neo-Mandaic word for money. But Ahwath is the morphology of Neo-Mandaic, in which the first yod verbs become first art verbs, first aleph verbs, essentially. So the verb for gives is qa'ahiv, ahvat, and not ihvat or yahvat. Ahvat zuza, wa avdat harshi, and here there was something that was erased in the manuscript. Wa ahdirti anpi minnan. And the syntax here is a little odd, but the meaning is clear. She turned him his face from us. So this is the start of the story. The story is a family feud, that the father has 3 wives and that one of them incites the father against his other children, and the father is misled and essentially abandons the welfare of his other children. Now, because he's describing a family feud with lots of parties and lots of people who were known to the readers, presumably, but aren't known to us, it's sometimes difficult to understand what the story actually is. So I've done my best in the translation, tried to do my best to interpret this, but it's possible that I don't understand it entirely. In fact, it's very likely that I don't understand it entirely because we don't know who the people are. And so it's very hard for us to understand exactly what's going on. We were here. And then he says, so it says, and then this ma has been erased by the scribe himself. This isn't my erasure, the double in commas show brackets show that this is the scribe himself erased this word. Minnan, and then he says umin kul, and then he kind of breaks off. The sentences, partly because of the way they're written in the vernacular, they're not always complete sentences. There's quite a lot of parenthetic expressions here, where suddenly he'll break off and add some information. And then he says, Anan arbi wa immen bahamsha barnashi. We were 4, and with our mother, 5 people. Abqinnan min beithe. He removed us from his house, presumably because the second wife has incited the father against them. And we have Barnashi again, the plural. And then we have Wahui Mare Ziwa. Now, this hui is again characteristic of spoken Neo-Mandaic. The classical language is hu, very occasionally ihu, maybe two examples, one example. But the standard form is hu. And here we have hui, which is the form in spoken Mandaic. Or hui marizuza. And here you see that's marizuza that we saw in the photograph I showed you earlier, when at this point the text became unreadable at the end of the sentences. But by photographing it with backlighting, it was possible to read most of it. Umare Rawaha. And he was a marizuza, a wealthy man, Umare Rawaha, and prosperous. Khayre bishminni. And Khayre seems to be this person that we mentioned before, one of the wives, right? The second wife, because she's mentioned here. Bish is more, Persian, not used that frequently in Neo-Mandaic, but is found. Minni. Aqinan bela minda. I mentioned to you when we looked at the manuscript of the prayers, the text of the prayers, that the scribe had written the mem of mindam above the line, as though he forgot it and then added it in. Here we see the Neo-Mandaic form, minda instead of mindam. This is the Neo-Mandaic form, and this is used in the late Mandaic manuscripts. I want to stress again, when I talk about late Mandaic manuscripts, they're all late. All the manuscripts are late. But as I said, the manuscripts are divided between different contents. So the manuscript will have a copy of the Ginza Rabba, an ancient text, or even a magic formula. And at the end of the manuscript, you'll have the colophon, which is written in the contemporary dialect. So that's the case here. The Mahito Asufa text is probably of the middle period. It's not late, but it's not early, but it's maybe from the Middle Ages. It's a ritual text dealing with, I told you, ritual mistakes and how to correct them. But the colophon is entirely contemporary of the time that the copyist is writing. And here we have a strange form. It says Umaqassarat Imme. The reason it's unusual is I would expect Iqasrat, my mother fell ill. And here we have Maqasrat, unless it's Wama Qasrat, and when my mother fell ill. I'm not absolutely certain how to interpret this grammatically. It clearly, I think that Qasrat means to be unwell. As we see, she dies. May the relief of life reach her. And here we have the participle without the qa, because this is a blessing. May it. This is modal. Zgat, and here he's written zqat instead of zgat, but we know that the Mandeans in this period, is very clear, are pronouncing the qaf like gimel. And so it's quite feasible that they didn't distinguish the two. We know that in Persian as well, often interchanged in the way they're pronounced in certain Persian dialects. We know that in the Bedouin dialects, in the Iraqi dialects, the Muslim Iraqi dialects, the qa is pronounced as g. And so it's quite feasible this is pronounced qat or something like the Persian qa. And they will write it sometimes with gimel, we saw zga, and here you write it qat. Another phenomenon that characterizes the vernacular. Start And then we have urkai, and urk is Neo-Mandaic for with. The word urk simply means with in Neo-Mandaic. So this is Neo-Mandaic. She came with me al-Jazir, to the Jazir. And then we have utrasit, and you'll see that the tet is pharyngalized and the samech trasit is not. Now, in classical Mandaic, this root is tav resh sadi. So it's the sad that is pharyngalized and not the ta. But in several late Mandaic texts, we find, and in Neo-Mandaic, we can find talas where the plet has been pharyngalized and the sadi isn't. So again, this is a Neo-Mandaic phenomenon. Utrasit wa arsit, huwa nother marai, another is of course Arabic, the gaze of Mare de Rabutha, the Lord of greatness, Ilaitha Barabe. And Barabe, Barabar, is a Persian preposition which has entered Mandaic in late texts. We find it in some late ritual instructions, fairly late, and it's used here. It's not common. It's certainly not early. Brave, towards me, upon me. And now the text becomes a little bit difficult. It's not clear. As I said, the narrative is not entirely coherent. I try to understand it the best I can from the words that we have, but he doesn't tell the story in a particularly clear way. So she says, Gihkat Lawi, she laughed at him, Elave, if you want, Waqam Uzga, so he went, he arose and went, Al-Qar Qadi. And so who laughed at whom? It's not clear. This is the problem. We don't know who is laughing at whom. She laughed at him, and he arose, and he went al-Qadi, and he went to the judge, the Qadi. And now we have another very typical Neo-Mandaic construction with Kazb al-Baythi, and he wrote his house, wrote over his house. So first of all, he hasn't written the here, but that's just vulgar spelling. In this period, we would expect them to write the But what is more notable is the here, because in classical Mandaic, this would have to have agreement. The proleptic pronominal suffix would have to agree with the object. So it would have to be kazbi with the hey at the end, with this sign at the end, al-Baythi, because Baith is masculine, or Bieth in certain Neo-Mandaic dialects. But what we have here is a phenomenon that we find in spoken Mandaic, which is that the il is essentially affixed to the verb kathvil biethi. And this vowel here doesn't matter if it was the masculine I, the feminine a, or the plural u, which becomes the pronoun for the plurals. It is reduced to a schwa in all cases. And so this was pronounced something like wakadul bethi. And how you write this vowel, or even if you write this vowel, is irrelevant. They didn't have a sign for the schwa, and sometimes they'll write it as a, and sometimes they won't write it at all. They'll just add the L at the end of the word. I think there's an example later. Certainly in the article I gave you, you'll see examples of this phenomenon, where the il is simply affixed to the previous verb. Again, not a classical Mandaic phenomenon, a neo-Mandaic phenomenon. وكذل البيثي ومندي and his possessions, and minda has a plural, or mindi can be also collective. So this E is probably a variant for this E here, because they were pronounced the same. The plural in the classical language and the E, the pronoun, were pronounced the same. So Umindi, he wrote over his house and his possessions, Qam, two. And in Neo-Mandaic, Qam is not before, or Qadam. It simply becomes the word for two, to in English, the preposition. Minni Qam Inthi. And he writes the nun here of Inthi in Neo-Mandaic, that would be Ethi. But whether they were pronouncing it or not, I don't know. Whether this is a classicism or in his dialect they still pronounce the nun, we can't know, because what we know of Neo-Mandaic is only what survived, and it's a very small amount of what we had, of what there was. And we can see it's a small amount of what there was, and that the dialects varied more from texts like this, where we see forms that are very clearly colloquial forms that haven't survived into the contemporary vernacular. And when we have several texts, we see that these forms are not arbitrary, but they're shared between a number of texts, which implies that they were part of the spoken language of the 17th century, but haven't survived into the dialects we have today. Now, anyone who deals in modern dialectology of Aramaic or Arabic or any language knows the enormous variation that we have. And if we imagine that most of these dialects died out and that only a few of them survived, it wouldn't surprise us that all of that wealth of linguistic variation has been lost. So we are left at the end of this process today with one living dialect alone, with the dialect of Ahvaz. Until recently, I don't know if there are any Khorramshahr speakers alive. When Charles Hebel did his work, there were still a number. Today, there are almost none. Haweza, there are no living survivors of that dialect, and there were other dialects as well. So it's not surprising that when we look at texts from the 17th century, they use Neo-Mandaic forms, vernacular forms that aren't in the classical language, but also haven't survived into the contemporary Mandaic languages that we know today. So he wrote his things, he wrote his possessions over to his wife and his daughters. And he said to the judge, and here we see lika, and this is a classicism. They don't use really lechto, they use it nowadays, but it doesn't matter. There is no. And here we have a strange word, zeij. Zeij. It clearly means woman. It means woman or wife. And we see it in a number of texts. We have zeij, we even have a plural zijan. The etymology is unclear. The usage is clear from this text and other early Neo-Mandaic texts. And again, this is an example where we have something that appears in these texts, does not appear in other texts, does not appear in classical, and doesn't appear in modern, and we have to understand it from the context. These texts have to be deciphered. They're very different from the classical text. It's a different language, and it's sometimes very hard for us to understand it, because not only do we not have a large corpus of them, we also don't have a lexicographical tradition for them, and we also don't have this contemporary spoken languages from around. We don't have Southern Iranian, Lurian dialects with from that period. We don't always have attestation of Southern Mesopotamian Arabic from that period. So sometimes these words are not known to us, and we have to interpret them from the context. So again, as I've said about all of this work, and it's something I hope is coming over to you in these classes, these talks, is that this is a work in progress, and I'm on the one hand satisfied with the progress that we've made. I feel like there's been a significant contribution to the advancement of the study of these texts over the past decade. On the other hand, we have to have the degree of humility to understand that we don't always understand things. I can tell you that I already have corrections for this article, which is from what, 2019, and I've already have things here I could correct. So this is the way it works. So he wrote, he said there is no woman, Kare, by me, chez moi, with me. Again, this is where the English language is lacking, because we don't really have a word. We don't really have a good expression for this. We don't have the right preposition. There is no woman here with me in my place. Ghair, and this is clearly ghair from Arabic, or ghair, meaning other than, and it's found in a number of late Mandaic texts. So it's a borrowing. In classical, it would be illa, and not the illa that means the rib, the illa that means other than. And it's entered in to the Neo-Mandaic here quite commonly, meaning other than. And here we have now a pronoun that is not found elsewhere. Tan benatha, these daughters. So this pronoun tan, we have ta in late Mandaic texts, an example of a word that is not found in the classical, which is hanati or hanata. It's not found in the modern, which uses aha or honi, these. And here we have a pronoun ta, this. We have here tan, plural, these, which is not, I don't recall if it's found in any other text other than this one, but it's clearly that's what it means. Ghair tan banata, other than these daughters. Wa ana tarmida. And this has been accidentally omitted from the translation. And I think the translation here needs to be corrected. I think here it may be, I think it's not clear who's speaking. Is it the writer of the text who's speaking, or is it the father who is saying this to the judge? I did say to you that the text is quite difficult to follow, but it's accidentally been omitted, and it's possible it's possible that here it's the author writing, that by omitting these words, we've confused the translation. And my sisters were in my qari, were with me. So maybe this is the writer of the text speaking again. Maybe that was the end of the citation here, that there was banata. And maybe it's, but as for me, the tarmida, and tarmid is like tilmid or talmid, as a student, but in Mandaic, it's a type of priest. Tarmida is a priest, an inaugurated priest. He's not a senior priest, those are the Gonzivre, but he's still a priest who's allowed to carry out the rituals. So we have Qari again with me. Hadabra, and Ibra is son. And one Ibra, son, Awira Qari. And there was one blind son with him. Now, originally he wrote Qara, and he added the yod above the line, presumably with him. With whom? With the father? Perhaps. Or perhaps it means he had one blind son. Wala hasali. and he did not have mercy upon him. Wala amar aha, and no brother said, aha, abba, father. And shahi, I don't know what it means. I haven't managed to find a good meaning for it. The reading, if I recall, was certain. I don't know if we have the photograph here, but nope, I don't have it here at the moment. But the reading was certain, but I couldn't work out what it meant. So if you look at the translation, it's father. I've left it blank because I'd rather not make something up than propose something that I am not certain of. And then here we have gum, for. So it's obviously something, do for, give for, ta'awira. And here's the ta that I talked about, this or that, awira. So no son said, father, for this blind person, haqqa the mi'ash. And haqqa the mi'ash is a livelihood in Iraqi Arabic. It's a word that's known. So haqqa the mi'ash seems to be the portion for livelihood. In other words, maintenance. So he's saying he left the blind son without support, financial support, and none of the brothers said, father, give financial support to the blind brother. Inish la minele lawe mawe gamishan. Nobody swore about him. Yamin is to take an oath. Mare the Gamishan. Gamishan is a word meaning water buffalo. I owe this identification to Khazin Mustafi, the only person who knows the name of every language in every animal in every Semitic language. So if you have an animal, you need to be identified. You go to Khazin and he will immediately identify for you. It's a word that he found in Neo-Mandaic, meaning a water buffalo. And here we have Utrain Baithi Ditinna Min Beithwatha the Shushtal. So we had water buffalo and 2 mud houses from the houses of Shushtar. And here we have an interesting phenomenon that after the numeral, we don't have the plural. We have Baiti. We have a different plural. The standard plural for the word Baith in Neo-Mandaic is Bethwatha. And that's this word here. This is the regular plural. In classical Mandaic, we will have Batti, like we have in Eastern Aramaic. We also find the form Baiti. We have it in some of the magic texts. Nerdica wrote in his grammar that these were corrupt forms or late forms, but in fact they're found in the classical text. So in theory, this could be an example of that. We could just have 2 plural forms. However, in a number of places in these texts, we find that after a numeral, we have the singular form with this E ending. And this phenomenon is also found in Persian, in some Persian dialects. And so it's possible that this is an influence of Persian, that you use after a numeral, you use the singular with the indefinite article. 2 houses from the of mud, the tina, min beithwatha the shushta. هذا 1 زبني إلاوي أرزين break the khair is there wrong. And then this is either he sold it to Arzin, or I think one of which had sold to him somebody of Arzin, son of one of that sold him was from Arzin, son of Khere Zichron. And again, without knowing who these people are, and without knowing the story, it's very hard to understand who did what to whom. Wetha Hadayoma, and a day came, Hadit Arasa. And Hadith, I have interpreted as saying the Pa'il of Hadith, to rejoice. The sentence is difficult, because Arasa can also be a wedding. It could also be a wedding occurred. Ula Araste de Barnashi. But I think it's here, Hadith, Arasa Ula Araste de Barnashi. I was celebrating with a groom and bride of some people. But now we have the next stage of the family feud. So the second wife has cast spells against them and paid money and turned the father against them. The father has written his property over to the wife and daughters at the expense of his other children. And now comes another story. He was celebrating a wedding, whether precisely how it comes out. Arasa or Araste is definitely connected to a wedding. It's bride and groom. Hamat Bratta, a daughter, or perhaps her daughter. Again, it could be Bratta. Hamat arose, legatte ledikne. She grabbed my beard. Upalga dikne bida athas. And half of my beard came off in her hand. So if it wasn't bad enough that the mother has turned the children against the father, turned the father against his children and dispossessed them, they now attack them. It sounds like a great family to attend a wedding with. Sounds like basically your average family feud. So we've had the personal feud, we've had the financial feud, and now we have the fisticuffs, the fighting. Upalga zitni bida asaf, wala amarli minda. As this would be in the Talmud, la amarla le wala midde. He didn't say anything, and he didn't say anything to, presumably la, it has to be. Didn't say anything to her. Wala, and this is the example I mentioned about the L being attached to the previous verb. It says wala zibne libbe. He didn't, and it's by my heart. Presumably, this means to appease me, to buy the heart of it. He didn't come and apologize, or it's an expression that we don't know from elsewhere, to buy the heart. I put it in inverted commas in as a literal translation. The meaning would seem to be he didn't come and say, oh, I'm sorry, what can we do? This is terrible. Wala amarli, and this is again, he's used the masculine for the feminine. He didn't say to him, but we know it's a daughter who did this. But then suddenly he's gone back to the feminine forms. Einich ilyogivni, gavinich. Your eye is above your brow. So he didn't say anything about the fact that she'd attacked me. He didn't say anything to me to try to appease me. And he didn't say to her, your eye is above your brow. And this is clearly an expression meaning that you're behaving arrogantly. Your eyes are above the top of your head. It's an expression meaning arrogance. And here you see that the preposition is not ile, It's here become ilyo, as it is in Neo-Mandaic. It's possible that the preposition ille or ille had several variants. I haven't been able to establish why he uses one variant in one place and one variant in another place, but we can see that it has the variants and that they have the y there, ille, ilyo, and this is characteristic of Neo-Mandaic. And then he says, Hayya Shummi. Her name is Hayya. Or Barabi. And before him, and here we have Barabar, we mentioned, is the Persian preposition. It appears here twice. Qaqayma. She was standing. And here we have again the qa prior to the participle, giving it the present tense. وَقَلَّيْتَ or later, she was cursing. And here we have qahwa, and she was giving. And again, the yahav, the root is yahav, but it has shifted in Neo-Mandaic to ahav. So you have have, ahvat, she gave, qahwa, she is giving. And we have as the infinitive in some late Mandaic texts, ahava, the giving, or to give. It's used both as an infinitive and as a gerund. Ahava, ahava the mani, the presentation of the ritual garments is the name of a text in Mandaic, of a priestly instruction text. Waqahara hadith lashawi, and hadith here is definitely Arabic hadith, meaning speech. Lishawi, and this is an expression from Neo-Mandaic, leshawi, meaning worthless. And then he still seems to be sorry about what's happened to his father, because he prays for the well-being of his father. And he says, "Hu Baban, for he is our father. And the father of all exalted greatness, all of the religion. May Mandaic forgive his sins. Anin. And here I was not able to understand the text, exactly what is done here. There were problems reading it also, and there were difficulties in the reading, and there were difficulties in the interpretation. And then it says, but he continued, here it becomes comprehensible again. As I said to you, if we look here, I'm just going to show you the picture again. We look at the text, we see that you have these this is the text here. Ilawan, Mare, is that an aleph? Is that a correction? It's a one-off text. We don't have another copy. What he wrote is what I can interpret, plus you have the fact that these parts I had to decipher from a text illuminated from behind. So there are a number of difficulties here. This is where you have the gimel and the qaf. We'll go back to reading the manuscript, just to let you know that this is what there is. And it was worth putting in the effort because of the importance of this text, because there is not another text like this from this period written in the vernacular. It's absolutely unique. The other texts that I published in the same article have vernacular influences, but there's none of them that appears like this, which is really in the spoken language. It's extremely rare. You have to remember that the priests are taught and educated in the classical language, and their spoken language wasn't really written. So it's extremely rare that somebody decides to pour out his troubles in writing using his spoken language. And it says, Wahui, and here we have the huya again, meaning he. Lao hazinin Then Hazinan, if he saw us, Qam haddar al-anpi, and here again we have this thing, like we had up here. I had another example here with the lamed, Zibn al-Libai, where the shva of the Zibne le Libai has been omitted completely, and it's become Zibn al-Libai. Zibne le Libai. Here, Qam haddar le anpi, Qam hadir le lampi. Min sharan, and shara is direction, and we know this because this is quite common in text from the 17th century onwards. Around the 17th century, we find this word shara. Not absolutely sure what the etymology is, but the use is absolutely clear. We have in the prognostic text, in the Sfar Manawashi, things like that the king came from this area. A king will come from Persia, or will go towards Persia, and the word shara is used. So it's the meaning is absolutely clear. Okay, so he said he would, if he saw us, he would turn his face away from us. Now in Neo-Mandaic, the word for face is appo and not anpa. We find here he uses anpe twice. But again, it's like antha. I don't know if this is a classicism, it could be, or if it was simply in his dialect, it was still pronounced anpa. Who knows? If we found a lot of texts in the vernacular and they use anpa, we would assume that that was the case, that it was, that in his dialect was the case. Uzga, and he went. Qarmandai, and he went to the Mandaeans. Urisha Daqina, who Ustad something or other. Dat Dihdad Shahin. We don't have the beginning of the name. I mentioned to you that although I was able to photograph underneath the patches that have been put on the text, the right-hand margin, sometimes some of the letters were lost, which is why they had repaired the manuscript. The patches were to repair breaks and damage to the manuscript. Very often, as anyone who's dealt with manuscripts, especially scrolls, will know that, but not only scrolls, that it's usually the last page and the first page that are missing, because those are the ones that are most exposed. Either it's rolled inwards or it's rolled outwards. And so it's usually at the beginning of a manuscript and the end of the manuscript that are most likely to be damaged. And what you have either in a bound codex or in a rolled scroll is that the beginning and end will be missing or damaged. So in this case, it's the end of the manuscript. Waqam Rili, and they said to him, Hani, Hani, and these people said to him, presumably the Mandaeans. The father had gone to the Mandaeans. Hani is Neo-Mandaic for these. Of course, it's also known, for anyone who's knows Babylonian Aramaic, knows that Hanne is the pronoun in Babylonian Aramaic for these, the demonstrative pronoun. In Neo-Mandaic, it's both the personal pronoun and the demonstrative pronoun, Honni, meaning these. They said to him, Waqamri le Honni, and they say to him. It's either they or these. Zeish, and then here we have something that's been erased in the manuscript. Zeish, the woman, Anbik Sanya, she hates your face. Anbik must be unpick. Well, Bazire, and here it's a question, is it Bazire, my children, the children? The question mark indicates this is an uncertain reading. Qamiqlu, she is maltreating them, and this is from Ain Vav Quf, mi'ik, qamiqluhu. And then we have Talu. Maybe she told them. The U here is instead of Lahon. So we saw in this text behind me, we saw do you like my wallpaper? It's lovely, isn't it? I have the same decoration in my office. When I'm at home, same decor. We saw in the lamella that we have the E ending for hin, and here we have the U ending instead of lahon or lahu in Babylonian Aramaic, or lon in Mandaic, classical Mandaic. Or Eid, and in the festival, and this is clearly Arabic Eid because it's written with the ayin, the Arabic ayin. Taha ahaba, and here I'm not absolutely sure what it is. The taha could be that. It could be a demonstrative pronoun. Ahaba is giving, of that giving. I don't know what it's referring to. It's referring to something that they knew what it was, and I don't know what it is. Ginvu, Ginvu. My house, they stole. They stole my house. Presumably this is the author writing this. The author saying, they stole my house. El-Beithi, my house, Ginvu, they stole it. Wala Sahidyun Ilawe, and they didn't attest about me or give evidence for me, perhaps give evidence for me. Nobody was willing to go to court and give evidence for me. Sahadyun, the yon ending or yarn ending is very characteristic of Neo-Mandaic. It's the ending in Neo-Mandaic of the verbs. If you want to know about Neo-Mandaic verb morphology, the article to read is Chezi Mutsafi's article, because what was written by Matsuch was extremely inaccurate. There was an article by Chezi Mutsafi about verbal morphology in Ahvaz. Here, I'll just pull it up for you. Verbal conjugations in Neo-Mandaic dialect of Ahvaz, in which he corrects all of Matsuch's nonsense. And as you can see, the third person common plural is Nishakyon. So this Nishakyon. So this would be here. Oops. Here, Sahadyon. Now, in some dialects, it's actually an o vowel, and in Ahvaz, it's a kamatz vowel, o, and then some of them it's more o. It's not significant for us. So here again, we find that the verbal morphology is equivalent to that we have in Neo-Mandaic. And he says, well, amal, which could be Arabic amal, hope. It's hard to know. Wamare qayada, and God knows. Anin lazgini walathini. And here we have the E endings again, which I mentioned to you as being characteristic of Neo-Mandaic. But again, anin with the nun, the final N, but zgini. In the Neo-Mandaic dialects that have survived in the modern period, this is ani, not anin. But it's clear that the development was that initially the verbs shifted to E, and we have a few examples in the magic bowls and some in classical texts. But again, the problem with the classical text is that we don't know whether that's influenced the vernacular, because all the classical texts are copied at the time when they're speaking the vernacular. The fact there are a few very rare examples in the bowls suggests that perhaps it was an early phenomenon, but this anin didn't become ani until much later, until after all of these literary texts, these early Mandaic texts were written. It seems to be a very modern phenomenon. I go back to Chezi a moment and you'll see Nishakni, the Hilni. See this? This is the Neo-Mandaic form. وأني لازجيني ولا أثيني ومنداي كمريلا. And the Mandaeans said to her, Anin la ni, and fortunately we can't read this. I told you the beginning of the lines are damaged. Ilawa minda. We didn't anything for her. Qayamya qamdidu. And qamdid is wonderful. Gamdidu, if I go to here, sorry, not that one. We have here in these texts, qamdidu and qamdilla, to them and to her. And these are Mineo-Mandaic forms. We have here in the contemporary dialects, for example, qamdidu. So we also have qamdilla with a lamed. That's not found in the contemporary texts. So there are some minor differences. But the fact that we actually find qamdidu or gamdidu, this is entirely Neo-Mandaic. It's a preposition that was only known from the contemporary dialects until I found this text. It was only known from the spoken. It's not at all in the classical. And you see here that he's marked the second daled as rafa, as the. Now this is not found in the spoken language anymore. But it's clear that at this period in the 17th century, they were pronouncing this gamdidu, because he marks the daled as being the soft daled. Mamare, how are we for time? We have about another 20 minutes. So the Mandaeans said to her that the wife is evil, apparently. She swore to them by God, and it's not clear. Qamrila. They say to her, Laqan likahiya, and Lakan is Laukan. Were it an unreal conditional sentence. Even if it were that, obviously it's not the case. Even if there were no Lakan likahiya, walika mandadahiya, walika nahora. And this is the reverse of a prayer in the Mandaean prayer book. Ikkahiya wa ikkamandadahiya. There is a God and there is a. So they're saying, even if there weren't, Nahora kule gazala hawa baba gamza elahwa baba gambazire. A father would not steal for his children, perhaps from his children. Sahid, he attested, and now we have this preposition gud. Now, Drower in the Mandaic dictionary, gud appears. I don't know if I can find it here. If I pull up the dictionary for you. Gud. Here. And look what she did with it. This is the word gud. DC 51 colophon. Modern read gub equals gub in. This is not the case. It does appear in DC 51 in Poldama de Mia, a text from the 19th century. But it's very clear now from the very large number of texts we have that gud with a daled appears. It's not a scribal error. There are reasons for thinking in a text, the DC 51 text, that it might be a scribal error because there's a lot of mistakes. Although it is in the narrative part, it's not in the copying of the classical part. It's in the colophon. We now know that this gud appears in many colophon texts, not classical and also not contemporary colloquial. Late colloquial or early colloquial, depending on how you view it. Late literary, early colloquial, found in a lot of texts, not found in Neo-Mandaic today. And he says, Wahui, and here we have the hui again, Tarmida. Ukama sidrari. And sidrari is a lovely plural form for sidrane. Sidrani is the plural, and sidrari is the assimilated form. Ukama drash, ukama sidrab, ukama diwan in kazab. And they talked about how the father had written lots of, presumably the father, had written lots of prayers, lots of texts. And then somebody answers. Something kadhab. Something ha the kadhabi lakan kadhabi the ziva watikla. The books, if they exist, would be books of lies and falsehoods. It doesn't matter how many books they wrote. Their piety is irrelevant. And now we have and this is the formulaic. Now you should know. Taha, something. This have I written. Amrit wa kizbit. I have said and written. La mari binahi, baba binahi. If God were in peace, our Father would be in peace, or something like this. Urisha the bana udimba the banati. And the first of his sons, and this must be Bani, but he wrote Bana. Sometimes it's not clear. Udimba the banati. And the Inta, Uvnatha, the Sha'man, and the wife and the daughter of Sha'man, or that is Sha'man, Ubanata, Hiya, Bidriya, and here it's very hard to follow. Oh no, sorry, Ubanata and her daughters are Hiya. We had Hiya already, the daughter, or Bidiri or Khairi. Kul mul. And here we have this mul again. I think we had this, kul mul, everything. Qamdila, about her, and this is the qamdil, qama haymana. They believe everything about her. And here it also becomes quite difficult to follow. We have here something Abdi yanqi min brata da'amuni. The children from his uncle do, and because the text is broken, it's very hard to understand what it says. But here it becomes comprehensive again. Qambini, and he wrote mim initially, but now he corrects it to bet. He wrote qammini, but then he corrects it to qambini. We ask, min marai min mandadahi kul bishuta taqamati gud ruhan wa yanqan wa ahan, all evil that comes upon, befalls our spirits and our children, wa ahan, and our brothers and our sisters, udamindan wa kul man litli rabba, and anyone who doesn't have a master, presumably God, doesn't fear God, lakshawi is worthless. Lakshawi minda is worth nothing. Huya, hui, he, Baba, the father, Shriqli manda dahiya khataye, Ubab kul mare the Rabufa, Ilaita, Ukul Hainzaki. And then we come to the narrative part, which is less interesting to us because this is the standard end of a text in Mandaic. He's gone back to what we see in most texts, which is the copying history. So as you saw, this text is often extremely difficult to understand because we don't know, the modern reader, who these people are. It's hard to understand what their family relation is. The text is also broken. So the combination of not always having all of the text, not being entirely familiar with not being familiar with the people who are involved and the story and the reality that he's describing, and not always understanding the finer points of the words and the language, makes it quite difficult to understand. But I think that in most cases we've been able to reach a reasonable interpretation of it. As I said, I can correct more things now, a few more things in these texts that we've published here that I didn't realize at the time when I wrote it. But overall, I think it's one of the most remarkable texts that certainly that I have discovered, in that it provides us with an insight into the prehistory of a spoken language which we completely lacked previously. There was no way we would have thought that these phenomena that I've described that are shared with Neo-Mandaic were so early. They seem to be something that came out in the modern period. And then suddenly we find that in the text from the 17th century, we have phenomena that are shared with the spoken language of the modern period. Are there any questions? We have a few more minutes. I can answer questions. No, everything was absolutely clear. Nobody has questions? Great. Oh, Sæfer has a question. The invisible Sæfer has a question. But Sæfer remains silent. Speak to me. Okay, so very briefly, I will talk about, in the last few minutes, I've got 5 more minutes or so, and I will talk about the issue of the lexicon again. These texts haven't been introduced to the comprehensive Aramaic lexicon. Most of them haven't, simply because we haven't dealt with these manuscripts in this way. We tend to deal with particular work, and then we incorporate the material from the colophons along with that work. So, for example, in the article, the first text in this article has been included, the DC12 text, because we dealt with the work that DC12 preserves, the Pasha Harshi. The one from the Ginza, it has been introduced into the complex Aramaic lexicon. The one we read today hasn't, and I hope that at some point soon we will incorporate it. We've been mainly concentrating in the complex Aramaic lexicon on the classical corpus. As we upload the texts, the question has been what order we wish to deal with material. So my priority was to get all of the texts introduced into the comprehensive Aramaic lexicon as tagged editions. And briefly, if I try to show you, hang on, how do I do this? In the few minutes that we have, just 1 second, I'm just trying to make you all small so I can get back to the internet. Here. Great, here's the CAL. You now see the CAL, yes? You can see the comprehensive Aramaic lexicon. So if I want, there are 2 ways I can look for the materials. I can look here as a lexical search. So for example, we talked about the word for rib here, and I go into the entry for rib, and this word was not identified in the Mandaic dictionary. And here we see we have examples from Mandaic, Mandaic amulet, Mandaic here. You see this? You have this. Now I want to find all the places where it appears. I go to view complete quick keyword in context. I choose Mandaic, and I now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 examples of the word for rib in Mandaic. The dictionary contains none because it wasn't correctly identified. So that's one way that I can use this dictionary to find words. The other thing I can do is to do text browse. So if I want to look, for example, the Ginza Rabba, I can go into text browse. I have to go to Babylonian Aramaic because here it's recorded as a Babylonian text. And I want to know about the Ginza Rabba. I want to read the Ginza Rabba. Here we go. So here's Ginza Rabba. This is the first page of Ginza Rabba. I can read it in Latin letters, but I want to look at it in another language. I want to look at it in Mandaic. I press here, and now I've got it in Mandaic. Now I have it in Mandaic alphabet. And I want to know what the word Tarmidi is. I press on here, and here I have it. Talmid, student. And from there, I can jump to the entry. So I should have also shown you that if I have the word rib here, and I want to see, it says here, illa nafalle bedupre, a rib fell in his rib cage. I want to see where that appears in context. I press here, and I have it here. You see? And each of these words is tagged with a lexical meaning. So here, if I were reading the text, or I looked at the reference, I browsed for this reference, I knew that, and I pressed on here, I now get the lexical entry, illa, rib. So there are a number of ways of accessing the material. So the question has been, how do we work on this? How do we, what order do we enter the material? And my priority has been to get as many texts online as possible. As many of the classical texts, particularly, or the magic bowl texts, as we can. So for example, if we go to text browse here, and we go to Babylonian Aramaic, submit, and I go to Mandaic Lamellae, amulets they're called here. I can't remember, maybe amulet 13 is us? Nope. Which one is this? Nope. I can't remember which one I am. We will do a catalogue of these, which will make it clearer what they are. We're still working on the metadata of these things. We're always oh, that's another one I published. That was Schoyen number 9. So it must be this one. What's that? That was 16. Let's try 50. It must be 15. I think that was the previous one. No. Can't remember which one it was that we read. This is it. Sorry. This is the one. It's amulet number 17. And if we press up here, you'll see that it was the one that was published in Hebrew. So this is something we need to work on, is improving the listing of the text. Maybe we will do that. But this is now the text that we read. And for example, the word sivra, which was not previously known in Mandaic, if I look for here's sibra, and you see newborn child. So I need to add a citation here to show that it was newborn in Mandaic. And I do that with a program. I can do it today. And then in a week or so, that will appear online. So briefly, the material is here, but the lexical entries take much longer to write than it's the final stage, it's not the first stage. The first stage is to get all of the material online and have it tagged correctly. And then we enter the entries. Now I've tried wherever possible, where there are new words, to put them on into the entries already. This one I haven't done, I must have forgotten it, not noticed that it was a new word. So I will put it in here as newborn, and then it will be there next week maybe. So I've tried to give you a taster over the last few days of Mandaic, of what's happening in the world of scholarship, and what we now know about the Mandaic language compared to what was known, say, 20 years ago or 10 years ago even. And if you have any questions, you can always come to me. I'll see you all next week.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure is, and write to me if you have questions. Take care. Bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.